So let's talk about this sort of question of, with that stuff in mind, how do you pick? This is really hard because the criteria for like launching a company is very different than the criteria for doing research. And the most important thing, well, the most important thing is building deciding what capabilities you need, right? So when you start off, you need to know like what capabilities of a device do you need? Are you using camera? Are you using GPS? How much connectivity do you need? What screen sizes would afford you? Do you want to be on tablet or mobile or on phone, right? You need to think about those questions first. Once you know an answer to that, you need to think about your user population, right? If you're deploying in the United States, it's a very different phone population than deploying in Mexico City, right, or India. So you have to go try to find information about that. There are sources that have, like if you Google for mobile penetration and market share in different places, you'll find data about that that's pretty good. The third is how iterative you're going to be. And this is where doing research on iOS just kind of sucks. Because unless you sideload, so all this stuff, all these apps goes through the App Store, right? And as we know, Google Play is the big app store for Android, and the App Store is the big app store for iOS. The iOS App Store, getting your app deployed requires a manual review process, right? It's automated and manual review by their set of curators or whatever they call it. You have no control over the amount of time that takes, right? So doing research on iOS is super hard because it might take 2 weeks for your app to get deployed, or it might take a day, right? More often it takes longer than a day. You fix a bug, it might take a week for that bug fix to go out, right? You need to change your research protocol, it might take 2 weeks. You don't get to control that. Google Play Store, they're much looser, right? It takes about 2 or 3 hours from the time you hit publish on their web admin console to publish your app, right? That's why I say that doing research on iOS is super hard, because you can't iterate as quickly as early stage research usually needs to. Yeah. So the point for me is that if you're doing iOS development, you just need to be really careful to make sure that you don't need a high iteration cycle. Now, there's ways around that, right? On iOS, you can have people install debug versions without that same set of permissions, of sort of approval, and you can have them sideload it. So if you give people a build and they're technically able enough to like open it up on their computer and install, like if they're a grad student, for instance, then you can get it on there without having, or if they're willing to give you their phone, then you can spend a day loading 20 phones and giving it back to people, right? Or if you're giving them the phone to work on, right? So there are ways around it. But I generally advise that if you're doing research, if you can with the user population, it's much easier for you to do it on Android because of that. Like I said, there's ways around it, but that should be your default. Now, if your user population has iOS phones, then you're screwed. Then you just need to do that. You don't have a choice, right? So that trumps anything else. Okay, so that's about sort of goals and audience and thinking about research and how to deploy this stuff. So the 3 options I was going to talk about were, so people usually talk about native dev or web dev. So there's this idea that you can write a regular web application and you can save a web app icon to your home screen. And then they touch it and it opens up and it looks like a mobile app. It looks like a native app. So there's ways to write a regular website and make it feel, like a mobile app. But what the phone is doing, it's basically just opening up a web browser pointed at your URL without all the decoration around it to make it look like a web browser. It's just going full screen. So you can do that as a cheat, right? And then use web technologies. But then you can't access any of the phone's hardware. So you can't take pictures, you can't get GPS. Well, you could get GPS, but you can't access accelerometer, any of the other hardware stuff, okay? So that's sort of the lightest way, is just making your web app your website be mobile friendly, right? The next step in is saying, okay, I know web technologies, I'm going to use Ionic, which is, so Cordova is this open source Apache project, like Adobe took it and made something out of it, and this company Ionic took it and made something out of it. So if you want to write something that builds and compiles and goes in the App Store like a native app, but use web technologies, Ionic is the best one I've seen to do that. It's a company, so by no means it's not like free open source full stack. Based on open source technologies, they basically have JavaScript plugins that let you do things like, okay, try to get me GPS. try to get me, try open up a window to take a picture, and then give me a handle to the picture, right? So Ionic lets you basically have JavaScript plugins that let you access the hardware. So this is a quick path if you feel like these technologies are good to invest in. And I'll do a walkthrough of how that actually works. And they can deploy to multiple platforms. So the promise is that you can write that app and then do a build for Android and do a build for iPhone, and they'll look similar. You need to play by a lot of rules to make that promise actually be fulfilled. Right? So this write once, run anywhere has long been a mantra and a goal of software developers. Java for a while was saying, hey, write it in Java and it'll run anywhere, and that turned out to be BS. And now like Ionic is saying it, and it turned out to be partial BS. So be wary of that promise that you can sort of run it everywhere. But it's pretty much true. Like you can, if you write your app well following their conventions, then it can look pretty similar on an Android and iOS. Okay, with one code base, in HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, which is nice. So iOS, so that's Ionic and Cordova. You do web technologies to write your app. iOS, you write in this language called Objective-C or Swift. Swift is much friendlier in terms of a learning language, and you use Xcode, which is their integrated development environment. It has everything in it. So you just open this one app and you write stuff. Android finally has gotten better, and they have Android Studio, which is based on this Eclipse IDE, which is a huge one. You open it up, you get one window, and you write everything. You click the run button, it sends it to the phone. You know, super nice dev environment. Cordova, this Ionic, you're opening up, well, they have an editor, but really most people open up a text editor, treat it like a web app, test it in their browser, and then run something on the command line to get it onto their phone. Okay? Windows Phone and BlackBerry, like why would you even bother unless you have like 10 or 15 of those? Nobody uses these things. Another option in the commercial zone is this thing called Xamarin, which lets you write in C#, another language, and has the promise of you write in C# and then it can deploy to this phone, Android, iOS. So that's used a lot in the enterprise to do things like Bank of America, I think, uses it for its app to support multiple platforms, because they actually need to support like the rich BlackBerry executive, because that's who they are, so they write apps for themselves. So that's another option, but in research I never see people using that stuff. Okay, so that's an overview of the space and a little bit about how to choose. Okay, so here's what it looks like, and I'm going to show you examples, but I just need to give you a little more grounding. So you have your IDE, like Android Studio or Eclipse or whatever, or your text editor, and usually what you're doing is you're starting up an emulator. So an emulator is basically a virtual device that you start on your computer, and it operates like a virtual machine. Like it emulates the hardware, or pretty close. They do pretty well emulating. So you open up something up on your computer, it's a fake device, and you deploy your app to it, and it's opened up a socket. So it's opened up a pipe where it can talk back and forth. Like it can say, hey, emulator, open up, and I want you to install this build of the app. And then it installs it, and it sends back log messages and stuff like that, so that you can debug in here. This is great and terrible, right? Because you never trust your emulator. If something's fast on the emulator, it could be slow on the real device. Something works in the emulator, it could not work at all on the device. Something could not work in the emulator and work on the device. Like in Android, getting the emulator to fake GPS is kind of a pain, right? So it's really hard to test GPS stuff in the emulator because it doesn't have a GPS in it. You usually start off by playing here, but then when you get annoyed enough at your emulator, then you usually just have a phone that's plugged into your computer all the time, and you deploy to your phone all the time. And then you're like coding over here, and then tapping over here, and coding over here, and tapping over here to try stuff. You do USB connection, it talks back and forth across it to a real device. So the short lesson here is like, be wary of the emulator even though it's great, and always test on this at a high frequency. Before you go too far down a path here, make sure it works here, okay? Because you might pick like an architecture that feels fast here, but then sucks here. This is really hard. Well, the other reason Android is a pain in the ass is that testing across devices is terrible, right? Because there's so many devices with so many different constraints. One of the simplifying things about Apple is that they've kept their form factors really simple, and they have really wide adoption of their latest OSs. So like the libraries change in every operating system version, right? So like how you code something can change from version to version of iOS 8, 7, 6, right? It's really helpful that they've encouraged and set it up so that people stay up to date. So I don't have the top, like, something like 90% of iPhone users are in iOS, like the current 9 or iOS 8, right? That's amazing as a developer, that you only have to test against those two things. And then you only have like 2 form factors, right? 2 physical form factors to test against. That's way easier than Android, where adoption is much slower because the phone companies want you to buy a new phone every year, so they don't support older phones with new versions of Android. And the phone capabilities are so different, right? They have different buttons, often, physical buttons. And some have 2 cameras, some have 1 camera, you know, some have much more horsepower, some have removable storage, some have fixed storage. All these things make it a pain in the rear to test. So how do people test on Android? They either buy a lot of phones and try it out on them, or they use one of these third-party websites, which are kind of amazing because you upload your application, which is a .apk file, and then they deploy it onto a bank of 100 phones or whatever, right? You tell them what phones you want, and they deploy it on all those phones, and they like have cameras pointing at those phones, and they can touch it for you, right? So like you can say, okay, now click here on all the phones, and then it clicks there on all the phones, and then like half of them crash, and you're like, oh crap, so I want to focus on this one. That costs money, of course, so you pay to do that testing. So that's the difficulty with Android, right? If your user population has a ton of different phones, then with a ton of different Android versions, then you run into a lot of trouble there. In iOS, that's much easier. So it's give and take on all of them, okay? So that's enough of like introduction to things. So let me do let's get a little more practical, okay? Are there any questions about that stuff? That's just sort of the landscape of when you want to think about mobile, okay? All right.